of social engineering on the last day of interactive bat and cleanup. So I appreciate everybody kind of coming in, and you're here, and I thank you for that, because I know, it's winding down. It's been a long conference. I've been learning a lot in here, some of which, I keep tweaking this thing as I go, just incorporating stuff that I've seen over the course of the week. But we're going to dive in and talk a little bit. First, I'll introduce myself, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what I hope to get out of this session. But my name's Lance Hayden. I am the Chief Privacy and Security Officer for a startup here in the healthcare space called ePatient Finder in Austin. I've got about almost 30 years experience in security and privacy. Started out, as you'll see, we'll talk about it in a bit, started out with the CIA right out of college, and there's some reasons behind that as well. But that was sort of my introduction into it. Since then, I've bounced around. I was not an engineer or a technologist by nature. I was an English major as an undergraduate. So I have kind of done a lot of different things on the business and strategy sides as well as the technology side. Spent a long time working for a technology company, but starting with those original days as an intelligence officer, for me, security has always really been about people. And so when we start talking about social engineering, that is right at the heart of the target space, the attack surface, everything else we're dealing with. And so we're going to keep it kind of light again. I know, it's sort of the end of a long week, or not quite the end of South by, but really what we're going to do today is I just want to kind of take a walk through the history of this phenomenon. And a lot of times today we think about it in terms of phishing attacks or things like that, and we'll talk about those. But this is really about deception at a more basic level, and is becoming an increasingly large problem, and we'll talk about some of those issues as we go through it. But really, takeaways for this, I want to come away with this with everybody understanding kind of what is social engineering, or at least what's Lance's idea of what social engineering is after several years in this space. When did we start doing this? Hacking Wetware, hacking people's minds. When did this start to become a thing? How are we doing it today? And what does the future hold? And that's when we'll get a little speculative, both on the downside of things, which are kind of depressing, as well as the upside of what some of the practices and technologies that we have today can help us with, and how we can bring to bear some of the things that we've always used to fight these problems. So, let's go into the Wayback Machine. And the thing about social engineering, it's always been a thing. And you can go, all the way back to the beginnings of creation myths to find people lying to someone to try and get them to do something that is not going to end up being in their best interest. And the story of the garden and Satan and Adam and Eve and all of that, that's kind of one of the earliest ones where someone comes up and says, hey, what's going on? Well, I was told I'm not really supposed to do that, or bad things are going to happen. Nothing bad's going to happen. Go ahead and do that. And it really starts to try and trick people into doing things. Take it a little farther up. The Trojan horse, if you ever come across listicles and stories online about the history of social engineering or the best social engineers, Trojan horse is always going to be in there. We've got exploits named after, as a matter of fact. This idea that you hide something inside a deception that then does bad things to whoever you're targeting against it. I don't know how many folks have read Othello, but one of my favorite villains of all time, Iago, is an evil bastard. And his whole thing is he gets Othello to do every nasty thing that he wants him to do by just pretending to be his friend and pretending to be his ally and lying straight out to him. And so that's another, this comes up in pop culture and literary references all throughout our history. And we'll get to what this means. Deceit is one part of it, but this is something different than just lying or bullshitting or whatever you want to call it. At the end, what this is about is the masks that we start putting on to achieve specific ends. And in many times, those ends are violent, and not necessarily violent in a physical sense, violent in a communicative sense. And when we talk about the definitions of social engineering, I'll drill down into that a little bit more. But first, we probably need to go back and talk about, well, how did I get interested in this? I talked a little bit about there being some history behind me going into the intelligence community. And what that was is my introduction to this whole phenomenon of social engineering and deception at this level came in 1985 in Naples, Italy. My father was in the military. I was a Navy brat going to high school in Italy, and I had the experience of a very, very personal deception when my dad came home one day. I remember it. I was sitting in the kitchen doing my homework, and Dad came in and slapped down a newspaper, Stars and Stripes newspaper, had some weird dude with a bushy mustache on it, angry about something, and was like, I know this guy. And I'm like, all right, I don't know who that is, so what's this about? Well, the guy's name was Vitaly Yurchenko, and Yurchenko was one of the most senior defectors to ever defect out of the USSR. And it turned out, as he starts to confess this, that I'd spent my entire high school life in Italy, and it turns out that the entire time we were there, we weren't there for the reasons my dad had told me we were there for. We were there because my dad was a spy, and he had been running, the US government had been running him as a double agent. Imagine if you ever watch NCIS on TV, the NIS is what it was called back then. They did counterintelligence operations and counterespionage operations just like other agencies did. And they ran my dad as a double against the Russians. And so for 4 years, my dad had been pretending that he was a traitor that was betraying the Navy's secrets to the Soviets. And in turn, what had been happening is every time he met with the Soviets, he would go back and then tell the NIS exactly what they wanted, and it was a double. And so Yurchenko had used my dad as an excuse to get out of Russia and get to Italy to where he defected. And his whole point was, I don't think this guy's real. I think he's a dangle. And just that term, that intelligence term, a dangle, is what we call a provocation kind of operation like this, where someone isn't real but they pretend to be. Even that, you can start seeing the precursors of the sort of fishing language we get to today. That metaphor has been with us a long time. So that was my wake-up call at like 18 years old, realizing that the last 4 years of my life had been an enormous lie and that my dad wasn't really having an affair, and that's why he wasn't out all hours of the night. It was because he was a friggin' spy. So, that, as you might imagine, had a powerful effect on me, ended up convincing me to go into the intelligence community, and has kept this top of mind my entire career. And I actually even wrote a GQ article way back in the day that kind of described this whole thing. And so, it was an interesting experience. The other thing that was kind of an aside that's interesting is he also, even though I hadn't had any experience of it while it was happening, my dad broke the rules and wrote everything he did down in these journals. And so he's had those, and he gave them to me later on, and I could read day by day, meeting by meeting, all the stuff that he was doing and part of this, and all the different kinds of ways that it messes with your head. So, from Italy, let's talk about now what my definitions, how I kind of think about social engineering. Now, we can start with an actual industry definition that folks that are working on this full time have come up with, and I liked it. I thought it was worth kind of putting up here. Any act that influences a person to take an action that may or may not be in their best interest. This is the key point in social engineering that separates it from just, well, it's just lying. It's just deception. No, it's not. People lie for a lot of different reasons. And another great book, if you are interested in it, is there's a book called On Bullshit. Has anybody ever read that? It was a guy, a philosopher actually. He's a professional philosopher in academia, and he wrote a whole book that theorized the difference between lies and bullshit. And for him, a lie kind of, if you tell a lie, then you are trying to convince somebody that something isn't true, which indicates that you sort of believe that's true to begin with. Bullshit, you'll say whatever the hell you want to get what you want. You don't care, it might be true, it might be false, doesn't matter, because you're just trying to achieve an end and anything works. Well, I'll add to that sort of, if we're building a hierarchy, social engineering is sort of a form of communicative violence, because now we're not just doing it to get what we want. What we want is something that hurts the person we're targeting. It's something that attacks them in some way. So what I like to think of social engineering as is a weaponizing of trust, because that's what it gets down to. When you are victims of a social engineering attack, or when you're perpetrating a social engineering attack, what you're really trying to do is take advantage of an inherent vulnerability that people have, which is our inherent desire to trust what other people are telling us. And you're not only manipulating that, you're weaponizing it. Because if I fall for it and I trust, I'm going to do something that is going to be more or less bad for my well-being, or the well-being of my company or my organization or whatever. So, again, we're seeing a lot of this today with phishing and fake news and all these other things that we'll talk about, but it's an old phenomenon, and it's been happening well before the internet and the network age. So pre-internet, we didn't call them social engineers, we called them con men, we called them grifters. And you had, I just threw a laundry list of them up here. Victor Lustig, anybody ever hear of Victor Lustig? He sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. Found some buyers, said, hey, yeah, they're tearing this thing down, it's an eyesore, would you like to get the metal out of it? And they paid him to cart off the metal for the Eiffel Tower once they tore it down. If you've ever heard of the phrase, if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you, well, then you've heard of George Parker, because he did the same thing. He just sold the Brooklyn Bridge over and over and over again to different investment groups. So they would come in and they'd be like, yeah, he's like, hey, I literally got a bridge to sell you. And people would be like, okay, cool, and give them all their money. Ponzi's got an entire fraud scheme named after him. So, these are professional liars looking to achieve something that's not in the best interest of the people they're lying to. And, they've been around a long, long time. If you've also heard, there's all of these scams out there. And I remember one of the funny stories, I was working in the agency, and I remember we got a phone call because, long story short, without going into too much of it, someone called a line, they were pissed. And they wanted the CIA to do something because they had gotten a fax that offered to help them for a fee. They needed help. So if they would help this prince in another country repatriate tens of millions of dollars, they'd get a cut of like $2 million. So if they would help him launder this money, they'd pay him really, really well. And of course, they gave him some money as a down payment, lost a bunch of cash, and they were angry, and they wanted the CIA to do something about this because they got bilked in this scheme to help this foreign power launder money into the U.S. And it was just, I remember we were sitting there listening to them like, okay, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to go after and get your illicitly lost money back? But just the idea that someone would call up the government and say, I tried to do something really, really illegal, and I got swindled. Can you help me out? It was just kind of funny. But, with the rise of email, these things, they're not new. Spanish prisoner scams is kind of what morphed into what became known as the 419 or the Nigerian prince scam, and then morphed into the Afghan loot scam. All of these things. You get a fax or an email or a message or whatever that says, I'm sitting on top of a bunch of money or a bunch of loot or a bunch of treasure that I can't do anything with without the help of an insider inside the United States. So please help me do this and I'll pay you handsomely. And then by some quirk of either giving them your financial information or paying up front some repatriation fees that they've got to do or whatever, you end up losing a bunch of cash. And these had always been around. Again, I mentioned, we got ours, he had gotten his on a fax. I've been out of the agency a long, long time, pre-internet. But as email hit, these scams got a lot easier to perpetrate. And so they just exploded and started going everywhere. Propaganda and espionage, state-sponsored deception. Again, we're kind of in the age of fake news now. We'll talk about that in a little while, but I don't know that we've ever really left the age of fake news in the sense that organized groups coming in, and here it's not really focused so much on the individual as it is trying to get large groups of individuals to take some sort of change public opinion, to change the way people feel about things or what motivates them to take action. And as you can see from some of those posters that I kind of picked out, it can get really ugly. It can get really, you're playing on the worst instincts, so it's beyond just a trust issue. It's playing on misconceptions, all the stuff that we're hearing about today in the fake news debate as well. And sort of the underside of that is the espionage. Going back to, being a double agent is really being a social engineer. Going in and trying to convince someone. My dad had to go in and convince the Soviets that he wasn't a really patriotic American soldier that felt very strongly about going in and, you know, doing something for his country. The part he had to play was a money-grubbing traitor that was willing to sell out all of his colleagues and his entire government for cash. And it really messed with his head over years of doing this. So this idea, you know, and then, you know, I spent 6 years doing not a double agent. I was on the other side of it running things, operations, but it's still that idea that you're trying to get into someone's head and get them to do something. And in espionage, what you're trying to get is either have them give up secrets or have them, you know, provide services, whatever. But at the end of the day, if they get caught doing that, or if the op succeeds, probably not going to be in their best interest in many cases. So what does all this lead up to? You know, it's sort of a basic taxonomy of threat and response. People tend to be the end target of social engineers, either at an individual level or at a collective level. And you want to get sensitive information. You want to get money. You want to get motivation for some sort of action. That's what propaganda seeks to do. Get people motivated to do something that may or may not be something that they really want to do if they had a chance to think about it. And what we've done as all of these kinds of attacks have happened is we, in the past, have come at them in some fairly straightforward ways. We criminalize them. You know, you can't sell the Brooklyn Bridge over and over and over again, particularly when you don't own it to begin with. That's called fraud. We're not going to let you do that. It doesn't matter that someone's gullible enough to buy it. You can't do that. We regulate the process. Espionage, as much as it's often seemed, you know, especially during the Cold War, you know, this was a really, really process-oriented, rules-based game. You played it in certain ways, and there were certain things you did do and certain things you didn't do because you really didn't want to get to the point where you were encouraging people to do some of this stuff back if you were cheating. It was a weird place to live. And even today, you know, we'll talk about the Internet Research Agency and you know, the Russian hacking operation and some of the things that happened in more recent years. But there's been surprise even in some of these spaces where some of the operations that are being perpetrated break these decades-long norms of, hey, you don't do that. You know, you just don't. There's a process to this. And so we're seeing some of this start to change, but that was one of the ways that we would tackle it. And then we would train people. Training, awareness, and education. And as a CIA officer, I went through a lot of training on counter-espionage and counterintelligence, and to recognize when someone was, you know, maybe not just accidentally bumping into me and deciding that they wanted to be my friend. You know, it may be that that's something that I'm being targeted for something. So figuring that out, figuring out, you know, how to balance this idea of trusting and being very skeptical at the same time. And there's a cognitive dissonance involved in that that is sort of interesting to try and master. Cyber kind of changed everything, not in the sense that these problems went away or came back or were new or anything. It really changed things in the sense that it just made everything more efficient. You could do this stuff faster, on a much larger scale, much more efficiently, and you were still focusing on those same basic attack surfaces. People's trust and their propensity to believe other people or believe things that they might want to believe. And we ended up, you know, coming up with a whole new, this kind of getting into my career as a security person, we had different terms that we gave them. Pretexting, tailgating, you know, phishing, fake news. Has anybody heard of Kevin Mitnick? I imagine people have heard of Kevin Mitnick. Yeah, so, you know, Kevin probably wouldn't appreciate the mugshot I put up on him. If you go out and find a picture of Kevin today, he looks very, very different, much better. He runs his own security company now. But Kevin kind of touts himself, his brand is that he's the world's most famous hacker. And the thing about Kevin is he wasn't so much a technical hacker, he was a social engineer. Kevin's magical gift was being able to convince anybody that he was anybody he wanted, and to talk them into giving up information that allowed him to get into system after system after system until finally, in the 90s, he ended up on the FBI's radar screen, and then, you know, the U.S. Marshals wanted list, and finally went to jail. Got out, went through his period where he wasn't allowed to touch a computer, and then once he was allowed to touch a computer again, reinvented himself as a security awareness guy. He's written several books on it and talks about exactly these kinds of attacks and how to protect yourself from them. Tailgating. Tailgating is a practice of convincing people in an organization. Like basically, especially, we're in South by Southwest, we got the badges, right? Now you're trying to get into all of these talks, and there's going to be someone scanning your badge, a person that's going to check, and every badge gets scanned. Imagine if it was more like your corporate environment, where you had a badge and you just waved it at a panel, and it would let you in. I mean, that's where you don't have people outside usually checking badges on that. And so here, there's less of an opportunity for tailgating than there are in many other places. One of the things I did in my consulting days was we would run physical penetration tests and go in and try and tailgate into places, get people to let you in without a badge. And it is really, really not difficult to do. I mean, some of my more imaginative strategies were stand outside the door having a smoke until someone came in the door, and then just drop the cigarette and follow them right in. That one always worked, or worked a lot of the time. Another one, if it was a more tricky situation, I've gone up holding the really heavy-looking box that, can you please help me get in? There's nothing in the box, but someone's like, oh my God, I'm going to help you out. They open the door, hold the door open for you, you walk in. I've tailgated, into lots of different organizations, and it's even harder in organizations like that because we often feel this sense of additional trust and camaraderie around the people we work with, and we don't like, in many cases, confrontation. No one wants to be the person that's like, oh, hey, dude, where's your badge? You coming in the door? I want to see your badge. No one wants to do that. So you're just like, all right, whatever, let him in. And it's devastating. I mean, when we would do this, the next thing we would do once we got in is we would find an internal internet connection somewhere. I mean, again, old days, look for an Ethernet cable. And then we'd duct tape some sort of Mac Mini attack box to the bottom of a conference room table and plug it into Ethernet, and we'd be on the internal network, and we could go hog wild. So you can do a lot of different things. Tailgating, it's another big problem, but it's one of these social engineering attacks that takes advantage of people's trust. Then we got to talk about phishing. If we're going through the history of social engineering, this is the one that, today everybody talks about phishing. Phishing's a terrible attack. There's lots of different ways to do it. And it is one of the biggest worries that I have as a CPSO is that my employees are going to fall for phishing attacks. And so we have to test regularly to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because, depending on which statistics you buy into, 9 out of 10 successful enterprise security attacks often start with some sort of a phishing attack, usually a spear phishing attack. When you look at, the Podesta emails, that's how that got hit. People will fall for these attacks and give access to the keys to the kingdom inside that organization. So, for those of you that might not be familiar with the whole sort of phishing ecosystem, everyday phishes is just an attacker sending a message. It can be email usually, social media, looks more or less legitimate, sometimes much less, but the recipient is deceived into either giving up some sort of information, clicking a link, doing something like that. Well, that's how it started out. But it got a lot more you saw variants start to appear. Phishing works like a net. You throw a big one out, you catch whatever you can catch, and you're trying to sort of get a lot of different responses with one generic email. But the variants that really started appearing is people realized they could do much better if they put a little research into it and started targeting individuals. Instead of, hey, generic employee, we are doing some sort of a raffle. Click on this link to join. Now you're like, hey Joe, I'm out of the office today and I forgot this, and can you give me this information, or give me your password because I forgot mine and I want to share your whatever. All the different ways that we see getting in here. But the point is, it makes it look like someone is sending this to you, and it allows for a more specific response. Whaling, if you've heard of that, is a spear phishing attack that now targets big targets. You want executives. You want to convince the CFO that the CEO needs her to wire transfer $25 million to this bank account somewhere, or the company's going to go under. You need to convince a public figure or a politician, someone like John Podesta, to give up access to his entire email database because you plan on releasing that in dribs and drabs to influence an election. This is where now your targets are very specific and they're huge in terms of the impact of getting them compromised. And then as that metaphor continued to kind of have legs and really get applied to other areas, we saw all the phishing. Phishing is phishing with voice, over the telephone. Just, yesterday, as I was prepping this talk, I got a text from my mom, and I didn't really think of it. I was in the middle of something, and so I waited about 20, 30 minutes before I actually pulled it up. And when I pulled it up, she's like, I just got an email that says I bought a Microsoft Surface tablet. And they thanked me for my $400 charge or whatever, and if I had any questions, I'm supposed to call this number. And she's like, I'm good. This is real though, because it's got a phone number. It's not a link. I wouldn't have clicked on any links, but they wanted me to call, so I'm going to call the number. And so I'm scrambling to get my phone out, and I'm like, please tell me you didn't call the number. She's like, no, I actually thought about it and realized maybe that wasn't smart either until I talked to you. But this is the thing, a lot of times we'll trust a phone number more than we'll trust a link. Or if we can get a human being on the phone, we'll trust that they're not doing something nefarious to us. So phishing is an example. Smishing, this is the same thing, but it's SMS, texting, instant messaging. One of my favorites is angler fishing. Anybody hear of this one? Okay, it's named after, if you're Finding Nemo, the anglerfish with the little light that hypnotized them and everything. Angler fishing flips this dynamic. So an attacker will get on like Twitter, social media, something like that, and they'll come up with a tag or a handle that looks like a legitimate company. And then they'll start just waiting for someone to bitch about that company. I can't get into my bank account, Bank of America. What the hell's wrong with you guys? And that's when they'll be like, oh, and so B of a handle will be like, we're really sorry to hear that. Click this link and we'll reset your thing. So they're waiting for someone to see something and it's not sending a message to you. I've sent the message out. Now someone's responding to it. Well, no one would lie about that. Why would you respond to a message that wasn't directed at you? So angler fishing is kind of interesting and creepy. And then, it just gets weird. And fun if you're in sort of the pen testing. If you do this for a living where you're kind of helping people test this stuff, baiting is always baiting's evil. All right, so anybody familiar with baiting? All right, so baiting's really cool. I get a bunch of USB drives, and I preload them with the nastiest attack stuff I can possibly get, and then I just scatter them like pixie dust around the parking lot or around an office building, and I wait for people for a trade show, a big media conference somewhere in a hip town, and I wait for people to find these puppies and be like, I bet you there's some good stuff on this. And they pop it into their computer and they're pumped. And so, food for thought, if you ever come across just a random USB, don't plug that thing in, please. It's a very, very common, easily kind of, and again, for some reason, that trust factor, it's a physical object. It's not someone emailing me, it's novel, and I'm kind of curious because we know people put dodgy stuff on USB drives, so maybe there's something interesting on this thing. So we don't think, we plug it in, and we get on. Water holding attacks, if I want to go after a whole group, well, then what I can do is I can do a little research and figure out where do the members of that group like to congregate? What websites do they like to visit? And instead of targeting individual members of the group, I'll target that website. And if I can compromise the website, load it up with some good malware, then what's going to happen is the people that I know congregate there, they show up, they get the malware, and I've compromised them indirectly. Again, the metaphor is I'm a predator hanging out by a water hole waiting for someone to come up and take a drink, and then I pounce. So again, all these nasty attacks that smart adversaries have come up with. Dashlane put together a really nice sort of curated list. All of these stats come from different reports that they collected, but it gives you an idea of the breadth of this problem. 95% of successful enterprise attacks start with some sort of phishing. 3/4 of companies report being the target of these things. It's just going up and up and up. the attack works, so more people are getting involved in it, more people are realizing that this is an easy way to get in and compromise people. No one's immune, it's across industries, and really most people can't recognize a well-crafted phish, and many will go ahead and click on it. The first phishing test, I came on board with ePatient Finder, and one of the first things I knew I wanted to do is I wanted to run a phishing test. I just wanted to kind of get the awareness out there and just see what our vulnerability was. And one of our really smart engineering guys was ecstatic about this. He's like, it's about time, because I'm not really convinced that we're not super vulnerable to this. And I'm glad you're going to go out there and try and catch some of the people that might fall for this. Well, he was the first one I caught when I sent the thing out. And he was livid. Not at me, but he was like, I cannot believe. And for him, he got the email on his phone. And so the one point that he claimed would have clued him in was below what he could see on the small footprint of the phone. So he just hit it and went to town and got owned. It's hard. I do this for a living, and I remember my horror story, a company before mine, they ran a phishing test. I was expecting a package, expecting a UPS package, and so I just happened to, right place, right time, get a testing phish email that claimed to be from UBS. I wasn't looking. I was like, oh, my package is here. Click, and then I was like, man, really? And so then I had to go out to the web page of shame that says, yes, you've been caught in a phishing attack, and here are some tips on how you might look for that. But, it's really, really difficult. If you're not constantly vigilant, it's easy to fall into this stuff. And that leads us to when we take this onto a wider scale. We're not talking social engineering anymore. We're talking social systems engineering. That is this phenomenon of taking all of these different kinds of techniques and really wrapping them into something that probably is new. It's something we haven't seen before on the scale that we've seen. And this is, we've had propaganda, but the fake news phenomenon, and not just fake news. Oxford English Dictionary made post-truth their word of the year for 2016. And one of the things, I don't know if folks in here have visited some of the sessions over the week talking about fake news and media responses and stuff. It's pretty, one of the scariest one I went to was the one, does anybody else go to the one called the Infocalypse? The info apocalypse. That's basically, their premise was we're nearing a tipping point where we are not going to be able to function anymore as an information consuming society because everything is just poisonous. Now, I don't know if I would go that far, but it does seem sometime like we've hit some weird point where we really can't believe anything and we're cool with that there is no objective fact, and so why try? That creates a really fertile ground for some of the stuff that we're seeing, which is essentially these attacks at a much larger, more insidious level. I don't know, who's read the Mueller report on the Internet Research Agency, the indictment? If you haven't, fascinating read. This is an organization that was set up to do everything I've been talking about. To take advantage of people's natural propensity to want to trust in things that they believe in, and then to work that in a way that just twists them up and gets them doing crazy stuff, like holding up placards outside the White House wishing happy birthday to the Russian oligarch that is funding the operation. There's some crazy stuff going on in that indictment, and the way that they set this up as a budgeted, kind of heavily invested, very, very sophisticated organization is just sort of the logical end of this whole process, where now fake news becomes this kind of propaganda meets targeted marketing kind of phenomenon where we can tweak propaganda down to individual levels, really kind of measure how well it's impacting you, how much you're engaging with it, and then use that to refine the propaganda message to get you to do what we want. Frankly, it's a little terrifying. It's insidious, and I'm not exactly sure how to stop it. So one of the reasons I was really glad I'm doing a history of social engineering is I get to kind of stop at speculating about the future. I'm just here to tell you what's happened up till now. What's going to happen in the future, I will touch on that a little bit, but it's an intractable and very, very serious problem. But it shares much in common with all of these kinds of techniques and things that we've been struggling with now for decades and decades and decades. So, response strategies. Well, training, awareness, and literacy. And here's where I'm kind of going to narrow it down to the job I do and what I've been doing most of my career. I'm not worried about fake news at my level. I'm worried about it at a societal level, but that's not something I fight in my day job. I fight social engineering from the standpoint of phishing, baiting, all of these different attacks, trying to get into my organization and steal our information. And that's what most people at my level are dealing with today on a general level is trying to figure out how to protect their own organizations and their own individual users and their own individual selves from becoming victims to these kinds of attacks. Training, awareness, and literacy. Most people in here, if you're working for an organization, you've probably gone through some sort of security training. You may have gone through phishing attacks and phishing tests where you're getting these things sent out and people are asking you to report them, report the email, figure out what's going on. If you get caught with one, you may have to go for some remedial awareness training. But as much of a pain in the ass as that can become, that sort of human skepticism and human awareness level, that really is the first line of defense. We're not always really good at making it user-friendly, but that's where this stuff has to start. At a higher level, that sort of policy, regulation, and law, continuing to criminalize and organize these processes so that we know how they work and we know how we can combat them, that's another angle. Automation is doing some really interesting things around this too, and I'll talk about that when I do start speculating a little bit about the future in a minute. All the same techniques that are being brought against us are techniques that we can also use to defend ourselves. If you're, Gmail, and particularly Gmail, that's the one I saw the most recent stat, is really good phishing algorithms, anti-phishing algorithms. I mean, they can weed out 99% of most of the phishing attacks that are coming at you, but it's those ones that are still getting through that we actually have to worry about. And so trying to automate that using some of the new techniques around using AI, machine learning, these different kinds of buzzwordy things that are being put to use on this are also very important. It's a balance that I've seen. I've been in organizations where it's like, okay, it's all technology because users don't have a command line, and so you can't deal with them anyways, and you can't patch stupid, so let's just automate the users out of existence. That's not a viable strategy. By the same token, technology doesn't matter if we just educate our people. Well, the stuff gets too sophisticated, and it's getting more sophisticated by the day. So we need a mix. But what it really comes down to is what we need to try and do is I have my entire career been about culture building from a security and privacy standpoint. That's what I want to see happen, is when I go in, I'm not trying to create a security program, I'm trying to create an effective security culture. And I wrote a book on security culture recently where I explored some of this and trying to get into how we can build more effective cultural and human firewalls rather than just technological and engineering firewalls to help this kind of get better and to find different ways. Because I always use this analogy. If you're in the security biz, you will often hear people talk about security as being a people, process, and technology problem. And they'll pay a lot of lip service to those three pillars. You have to have all three of them or it doesn't work. Well, the kind of not so secret truth about the security industry is kind of like that guy at the gym, and we've probably all heard or run into this, does a lot of upper body work. Pretty much all he does is upper body work, doesn't ever do legs, so he's got an enormous torso, can bench press a small car, but he's got skinny little legs and never does cardio, so if you put him on a treadmill for more than 10 minutes, he passes out. That's the security industry. Got a big technology torso, skinny little process legs, and we don't do people at all. And when you've got a three-legged stool where all three legs are different lengths, that's not the most stable structure in the world. And it's one of the reasons that we continue to have incidents after incidents, losses after losses, because we've got parts of it down and other parts we've neglected. To that end, I actually, after doing a lot of research into organizational psychology, I actually created a culture model around security that, it's a different topic, but the point was I was seeing a lot of friction and tension. I don't know how many times I heard the security team come in and be like, we'd have this locked down if the idiots in sales just would do what we tell them to do. Not understanding that the idiots in sales had an entirely different compensation, business, priority, objective. The job they were supposed to be doing was not the job security was supposed to be doing. And as a matter of fact, the job security was doing was actually impinging, in their opinion, on the way that they were able to get their jobs done. So all I tried to do with this is create a culture model that I could go into organizations and help people talk to one another. Just help technical security folks, compliance folks, entrepreneurs, anybody else understand the motivations and the different sorts of cultural traits that were impacting their ability to get things done, whether that's the security team complaining because other people won't be secure, or whether it's the sales team complaining because security is the party of no, and the only thing they ever hear when they ask a question is, yeah, you can't do that, it's not secure. All right, so we spent a little time talking about future trends. In researching this, just looking at some things that were just scary. They're now getting into AI. Let's start with that. There's companies that are working on and claiming to be bringing AI and machine learning to bear on cybersecurity in general, but more specifically even to social engineering and phishing. I already talked about one. This is already there. If you aren't getting as many spam and phishing emails as you had in the past, it's because we've gotten very, very good at building filters to kind of get rid of this stuff before it ever sees your inbox. That's one way it's being used. But it's also being used to sort of figure out why people do the stuff that they do, to figure out behavioral patterns, and then to adapt systems in a way that will help and enable a user to, you see something come in and you're like, all right, you might want to think twice about this, or to customize training awareness programs, because we all know that they're generic. Every year you got to go in and read a bunch of slides that probably might not mean much to you. There's now techniques with some of the social engineering and awareness companies that are coming in and saying, hey, we can craft a really cool personalized one based on how you behave online. That's another way that it's working. The problem with this is, on the flip side, you've now got attackers using AI and machine learning to figure out exactly what kind of phishing attack, for instance, is going to be more likely to get your attention and to get you to click on it. And they can watch your behaviors, watch what you're reading online, watch all of this stuff, and craft something that is amazingly specific to your particular trust attack surface. There was a really interesting article I read just a couple days ago looking into this about a guy that put himself in a race with one of these. It was a contest to see who could phish the most people on Twitter. And the AI kicked his ass because it was better at figuring out what people would succumb to, and it was faster at putting the stuff out. So, that kind of freaks me out a little bit when I think about that. But if technology is going to make things worse, I am surprised at how much of an optimist I've been able to stay over 30 years in the security business. But I still am fairly optimistic about it, and I think that technology can help us too. I managed to get 43 minutes into this presentation before dropping the B word, but blockchain technologies, there's some interesting stuff going on around there in terms of the ability, particularly on the fake news side. I saw several people in this conference that are putting together companies and initiatives to try and apply distributed ledger technology to the fake news problem. That's awesome. I don't know if it'll work, but that's really cool. We can take these things and we don't just have to sit there and take it. The stuff that we've got to bear, we can bring to bear to kind of help fight the problem as well. And that's what we've always done. For as long as I've been in security, we've used two analogies. One is the mouse and mousetrap. We're always building a better mousetrap, and then someone else is coming along with a better mouse. That sort of race and tension. The other one is, all of these problems are Rubik's Cube problems. In a Rubik's Cube, unless you're really, really good, if you get one side fixed, you probably screwed up one of the other sides. And that's what always happens in security. I got this down. I'm going to make it all secure. Well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm not going to let anybody access anything. Fixed. Yeah, except that now we can't really do anything. So, you know, these problems are cyclical and they're iterative. And I've been around the track enough time in my career to sort of find it frightening, but at the same time, still maintain some hope. We've got a lot of smart people that are on this problem and trying to fix it. It's not the end of the world. It's just the thing that we're dealing with now is the scale and the speed and the efficiency with which it can get done. But, and I'll leave it, well, I've got one more thing after this, but people are the only ones that can fix it. That's where I will double down. Technology is not going to fix this alone. If you go back in your organizations, whatever, your companies, wherever you work for, if that organization tonight throws all of its tech out the window, when everybody shows up for work tomorrow, you will still have an organization. Because an organization is about people working together for a common cause. If tonight you go back and you fire everybody in that organization, well, when no one comes to work in the morning, no one is going to find a big warehouse full of blinky lights and a ginormous heat sink that doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore because there's no purpose behind it because it's just a bunch of tech that doesn't have an organization to support. And I really believe that. I think that it's a people problem and we have to solve it with people, and that's kind of where I focused most of my career efforts over the course of doing this. I'll leave you with, you know, in the agency we always had this term and it's applied and I've used it time and time again, probably heard it. I talked in the beginning about this as a thing of weaponizing trust. Well, one of the obvious, again, that Rubik's Cube problem, one of the obvious ways, well, just don't trust anything. And that sucks. That's not a really, really good way to look at the world. It's not a really, really good way to do things. Until, you know, maybe blockchain will eliminate the need for anybody to trust anybody. I'm not buying it. The point is, we are still going to need to trust, and I don't really want to live in a world where I can literally not trust anybody. So, the rule has always been trust, but verify. Make sure that whatever you're trusting in is worth the trust that you've put into it. And that may require us to do stuff we don't like to do, like slow down a little bit, like think 2 or 3 times before we take an action, but that's the only thing that's going to save us. And if we're not willing to do that, then it is over. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. I want to open it up. We've got about, I don't know, 13, 14 minutes per question, so I want to open that. They've said that if you're going to ask questions, please use the mic because they're trying to kind of collect the audio. So again, so thank you very much for this. That's my information. I appreciate it, seriously. I really am very grateful for everybody showing up on this kind of last session and giving me your time. Yes?
Hi, this was really fun, so thank you.
Thank you.
Why the shift from this over to smart healthcare solutions for you?
Well, so it wasn't so much a shift. What it was is I spent most of my career working for a tech company, managing programs, managing penetration testing teams, you know, doing a lot of technical stuff in there. Got into consulting.